Thank you. All right. In his book, The Natural Contract, published in 1990, and in a number of later works expanding on its main themes, Michel Serres argues that we must, quote, add to the exclusively social contract a natural contract of symbiosis and reciprocity in which our relationship to things would set aside mastery and possession in favor of admiring attention, reciprocity, contemplation, and respect, end quote. Such a contract would recognize, quoting again, all living beings and all inert objects, in short, all of nature, as having the status of a legal subject. The idea of a contract that has nature as one of its signatories is, of course, highly counterintuitive, and so it is not surprising that critics have raised numerous objections. In this paper, I will focus on two of them. First, that the contract in question is merely metaphorical, and second, that the metaphor is ill-suited to Serres' purpose. These two objections are closely related in that both of them raise serious questions about the normative force of the natural contract. If the first objection hits the mark, then all of the normative force that attaches to contracts understood in the literal sense would be lacking in the case of the merely metaphorical natural contract. But even if that objection does not hit the mark, a major problem remains. If the second objection is right, then the normative force that attaches to contracts, whether these are understood literally or metaphorically, is of entirely the wrong kind to address the problems that the natural contract is intended to help solve. My aim in this paper will be to defend Serres' account of the natural contract against these two objections. I will do so by invoking an unlikely ally, namely Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who argues in his Foundations of Natural Right that a kind of originary, unrepresentable intersubjective contract constitutes a necessary normative condition for the possibility of contracts understood in the familiar sense of the term. I argue that Serres' account deepens Fichte's insight, positing a more originary bond with the natural world as playing the same kind of role. Let me just say parenthetically that this is very much an essay in the old-fashioned sense of the term. I'm not sure whether I myself think that Serres' argument works or not, and so I tried my best to make what I take to be a reasonably plausible argument, but I don't 100% endorse the argument I'm making. I'm myself not entirely sure. So you can participate in shaping my judgment about this. Okay, the first of the two objections to Serres' natural contract is articulated most straightforwardly, and Stephanie mentioned this, by Luc Ferry in his book, The New Ecological Order. Quoting Ferry, one may object, and not without reason, that this is a metaphorical fable more than a rigorous argument. It seems rather difficult indeed to confirm literal meaning on the contract proposed by Serres, and then in parentheses, he says, hello, Mother Nature, let's be friends, end quote. Alain Roger similarly argues in his Court Traité du Paysage, long quote here, suffice it to say that Serres has evaded the debate, highly complex and currently contradictory, on the institution of nature as a subject of law. The subterfuge consists in personifying the latter by means of metaphors and capital letters, so that it acquires in the eyes of a superficial reader or one imbued with an unconditional environmentalism the status of an anthropomorphic entity or deity, and thus of a quasi-subject. Serres responds by pointing out that exactly these sorts of objections have been raised against Rousseau's social contract. Of course, quoting Serres, no one has ever signed this contract in a ceremony the date and circumstances of which could be documented. The general will has as few hands as nature, end quote. It does not follow from this that the social contract is a metaphorical fable. The social contract, rather, is an implied contract, that is, an agreement between parties that can be inferred from their behavior. An implied contract is a literal contract, giving rise to the same kinds of obligations as express contracts. But this response does not fully address Ferry's and Roger's objection. Their point is not simply that nature has never in fact entered into any kind of contractual agreement with us. Their point, rather, is that the very idea of such an agreement is incoherent. Unless we stretch the meaning of the word agreement beyond recognition, it is difficult to understand how nature could agree to anything. The reason for this, of course, is that nature is not a subject in the relevant sense. It is at best a metaphorical subject. If Ferry and Roget are right about there being no possibility of a genuine agreement with nature, either explicit or implicit, then there can be no contract. The obligation that is supposed to have derived from the natural contract then would disappear entirely. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, though, that Ferry's and Roget's objection fails, and that there can be an agreement between us and nature that is sufficiently similar to a contract to give rise to the familiar sorts of obligation. Still, an important problem remains. As John Clark points out in his review article on the natural contract, quoting, "The concept of contract is an individualistic and largely economistic one. It implies an agreement between two self-interested parties who give something with the hope of gaining more of what they value." End quote. This certainly represents the conception of contractual relations that we find throughout the highly influential contractarian tradition, which originates with Thomas Hobbes, and which is represented in the 20th century by Jeffrey Russell Grice, James Buchanan, and David Gautier, among others. As Grice put the key point at issue in his book, The Grounds of Moral Judgment, the reasons we have for acting morally, where this is understood on the contractarian model, are based entirely on our interests, and are therefore compelling even for someone, now quoting Grice, who does not care a brass farthing whether he is moral or not. End quote. If we are to understand our relationship to nature on the model of a contract, does it follow then that our reasons for upholding our end of the contract are ultimately self-interested ones? And if so, doesn't the idea of a natural contract encourage us to adopt precisely the kind of anthropocentric perspective that has caused so many of the problems that the contract is intended to help solve? There is an obvious response to this objection that deserves to be taken seriously. It is perfectly appropriate to endorse a contract model of our relation to nature without being obligated to take on board all the elements of the classical and contemporary contract theories. This, in fact, is a version of what I intend to argue at the end of this paper. It matters a great deal, though, which elements we mean to exclude and for what reasons. One possibility is simply to exclude the familiar normative elements from contract theory. Almost all contract theories, whether they're focused primarily on moral or on social and political questions, include some account of the ground of our obligation to adhere to the terms of our contracts. One compelling reason to include this element is that from time to time, people will inevitably find it burdensome to uphold their ends of agreements. When that happens, why should they do so? The answer for much contractarian theory is based on a game theoretical account of our overall long-term interests. But this kind of account is not mandatory. Indeed, perhaps it is not mandatory at all to include any explicit account at all of the ground of contractual obligations. We might want to argue, rather, that the idea of the natural contract is meant to be more suggestive, to provoke a kind of gestalt switch that would reorient our perception of the natural world. Once that gestalt is in place, we will just see the appropriateness of, quoting Sayre again, setting aside mastery and possession in favor of admiring attention, reciprocity, contemplation, and respect. This interpretation of Sayre's argument is suggested by, among other things, his discussion of the history of the word contract in the natural contract. He tells us that contract originally signified, quote, the tract or trait or draft that tightens or pulls. A set of cords assures, without language, the subtle system of constraints and freedoms through which each linked element receives information about every other and about the system, and draws security from all. This is the kind of metaphorical description that you don't typically find in contract theories. And so this kind of talk, though, would be perfectly appropriate if the goal is to motivate a different and better way of perceiving the natural world and our relation to it. I do not believe that this interpretation of the natural contract can be made to work, though. In various presentations focusing on the main themes and scholarly reception of the natural contract, there are basically 3 of these, and they're all called Return to the Natural Contract, and they're all very similar to each other. But Serre has insisted pretty adamantly that the book has to do with, quote, the philosophy and the history of law, and in particular, with the question of who has the right to become a legal subject. If the book really is intended as a contribution to the philosophy of law, then a conception of the natural contract as merely suggesting a new mode of perception would be inapt. Okay, up to this point, I've been presenting important objections to Serre's conception of the natural contract and evaluating proposed responses to them. My aim in following the back and forth of this dialectic was to help bring to light some desiderata for a successful response to those objections. At this point, I believe we're in a position to articulate 3 desiderata. First, a successful response must be able to show how the natural contract is more than just a metaphorical fable. What this requires is an account that can make sense of an agreement with nature without stretching the meaning of the word agreement too far. Second, it must be able to give some explanation of how the natural contract can ground genuine obligations. And finally, a successful response must take Serre at his word when he insists that the idea of the natural contract is meant as a contribution to philosophy of law, and specifically to the question of nature's status as a legal subject. To relate to another as a subject with rights is not merely to engage with him or her or it in a spirit of benevolence. This is still to relate to the other as an object. More than this, it is to engage with the other as having the authority to decenter our perspectives. That's what it is to engage with the other as something that has rights. What I want to argue in the remainder of this paper is that we can find a model for an account that might satisfy these 3 desiderata in Johann Gottlieb Fichte's Foundations of Natural Right. What Fichte presents in that work is a kind of contract theory, but one that is radically different from the familiar contract theories that we find in Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and Kant. On Fichte's account, it is impossible to ground political obligation in any kind of agreement among persons to respect each other's rights. So now you're thinking, how can that possibly be any form of a contract theory if that's the first premise? The answer is that Fichte posits a more originary contract as the transcendental condition for the possibility of the more familiar kind of contractual agreement described by the contract theorists. This originary agreement, just like the originary absolute self-positing of the I that Fichte describes in the foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre, is unrepresentable and unimaginable. The reason is the same in both cases. The agreement and the absolute self-positing are conditions of the possibility for our being conscious, rational, and free in the first place. Fichte's theory is a contract theory, then, insofar as it grounds the relations of right between persons in an agreement, albeit a transcendental one. It'll be worthwhile to spend some time on the detail of Fichte's view. And I apologize here because this bit is going to be a bit denser, unavoidably because it's Fichte. What can it mean to speak of a transcendental agreement? And how can such an agreement ground obligations of right toward other persons? We're still concerned with persons because Fichte's contract is not a natural contract. The key Fichtean commitment that points us toward the answers to these questions is that intersubjectivity is the condition of possibility for self-consciousness. Fichte's argument for this claim is difficult to follow, and there's no consensus in the literature about how precisely it is supposed to work. Nonetheless, the basic outline of the argument can be spelled out in just a few steps. To begin, essential to Fichte's whole philosophical project is a conception of the I as something radically different from everything else there is in the world. The I is its own act of self-positing. So it's not the case that there is an I who then goes on and posits itself. The I is that act. Understood in this way, the I is necessarily exclusive self-relation, free from determination by anything outside itself, because there is nothing outside itself. The next step is to determine how this act of self-positing is possible. What are the conditions of possibility for that? Fichte's answer is that, quote, a finite rational being cannot posit itself without ascribing a free efficacy to itself. In other words, the I that posits itself is an acting I, an I that does something. What Fichte means here is simply that to be free is necessarily to be free to do something, and that to do something is to effect some kind of change, to be efficacious. Third step. The first two steps seem to be in contradiction. Both of them are transcendental conditions for all of experience, but they seem to contradict each other. Here's why Fichte thinks. The activity we are seeking can be posited by the rational being in opposition to the world, which would then limit the activity. Turns out, in other words, here's the contradiction. The I must be thought on the one hand as exclusive self-relation, the pure activity of self-positing, but on the other hand as necessarily limited by another. In other words, the I is necessarily self-relation, but also the I is necessarily relation to another. This apparent contradiction is resolved, though, quoting Fichte again, if the subject's efficacy is synthetically unified with the object in one and the same moment, that the subject's efficacy is itself the object that is perceived and comprehended, and that the object is nothing other than the subject's efficacy. In other words, what I encounter in my relation to the world out there just is my own efficacy. So is there some object in the world that would present me immediately with my own efficacy? Fichte thinks, thankfully, yes, there is. Fichte believes that precisely this synthetic unification happens when another self-consciousness addresses a claim against me, demanding that I do something, but without forcing me to do it. This address is what Fichte calls an Aufforderung, which is typically translated into English as a summons. If I am able to even recognize the other's summons as a summons, then a cascade of transformative consequences follows. First, if I recognize the other's act as a summons and not just an event in the world or a bit of noise in the world, then I take her as not just trying to determine me, but trying to determine me to determine myself. Right? She's summoning me to determine myself. Second, my recognizing that entails that I take the other to be taking me as freely efficacious. There would be no point in her summoning me if she did not take me as the kind of person who could respond to it. I never summons my pen, for example. Third, to recognize the other as the addressor of a summons is to recognize her as a free rational being, because it's free rational beings who are the sorts of beings who can address summons. Finally, no matter how I respond to the summons, I will demonstrate to the other that she had been right in taking me to be a free rational being, because I will have determined myself. In sum, then, the relationship that originates in the summons is a kind of transcendental agreement to recognize each other as free autonomous agents. And this gives rise to a binding principle of right. And so this is just the principle of right from the Foundations of Natural Right. I must limit my freedom through the concept of the possibility of the other's freedom. I am certain that Serre would reject this argument, primarily because of the idealist account of subjectivity that is its first premise. What I want to argue in this last section, though, is that a decidedly non-idealist variant of this argument can satisfy the three desiderata described above for an adequate response to two of the major objections to Sayre's natural contract. And this is the part where I'm really trying out an argument that I'm not at this point entirely convinced of. I'd like to begin laying out this argument by drawing a sharp contrast between Fichte's and Sayre's conception of a subject. On Fichte's account, as we have seen, the I is radically distinct from everything in the world that is not an I. It is only through relations with other I's that I become a self-conscious subject. There can be nothing resembling an intersubjective relation with things, because those things can only have the status of an object for a subject. On Sayre's account, by contrast, there is no such ontological gap separating us from the natural world. Capacities that we ordinarily take to be distinctive of humanity, such as communication and cognition, are in fact continuous with processes that we find throughout nature. Sayre expresses this idea in a number of different works, and so I'll just take a few examples. In Récit d'Humanisme, for example, he writes that, quote, "Inert or living, the universe speaks as we do, writes as we do, talks and expresses itself as we do, creates databanks, remembers, translates, and sometimes even errs or lies, although rarely," end quote. And in The Incandescent, he suggests that, quote, "We integrate the know-how of many living things. We do the same with the inert. Something of the cognitive lurks in life and matter." Our thinking and our speaking, on Sayre's account, are of the world in both the objective and subjective senses of the genitive. They have the world as their object, but more fundamentally than that, they arise from the world itself. As Fichte had done in his Foundations of Natural Right then, Sayre gives an account of subjectivity as irreducibly relational. For both, I can be who I am only as a partner within a kind of communication, the very possibility of which points to an unimaginable, unrepresentable agreement, which is nonetheless very real. If Sayre's account of this agreement is correct, then the first desideratum is plausibly satisfied. Now, certainly the communication in question does not take the same form in Fichte's and Sayre's accounts. Nature does not address any kind of Aufforderung that would bring to light both nature's and my status as a free, fully self-conscious subject. Nonetheless, there is a commonality that is highly relevant for the problem that I'm trying to address in this paper. In both cases, the communication has as its effect the decentering of the subject's perspective vis-a-vis its partner. In recognizing the transcendental agreement that unites us, us being me and the natural world, we come to see the other self-consciousness in Fichte and the natural world in Sayre, as something more than a mere object. And with this change in perspective comes a normative change as well. We come to recognize that it is inappropriate to engage with nature as if it were merely an object. Inappropriate as a normative concept. If this last claim is correct, then we have plausibly satisfied the second desideratum. But finally, to say that the natural world is not merely an object is not to say that it is a fully fledged subject in any of the usual senses of the term. Nonetheless, there seems to be a family resemblance to the usual kinds of subjects, at least enough so that it should not seem absurd for nature standing as such to be recognized in law. If this last line of argument is correct, then we will have satisfied the third of the desiderata for an adequate response to two of the major objections to Sayre's natural contract. Thank you.
Thanks, Bryan, for that paper. That was really cool. I really liked, we threw in ficta. I was like, where the heck is this going? And you just like really brought it in there in a way that, I don't know, I think there's something to that. Obviously, you know, no, ficta would never agree with this kind of thing, and Michel Serres, but I think there's something to that, and I like this idea. You didn't use the word transcendental materialism. You just said transcendental, not idealism. But I'm gonna go with transcendental materialism. But I do have a question. So I feel like the first desiderata is like that one. I feel like maybe this is resolved. The third one, close, also close. The second one, I'm still hung up on. I wonder if you could say more about this normative function, which is, because what is the status of inappropriate? Because I mean, I think it's just, maybe we wouldn't question whether anybody might feel that it would be inappropriate to harm a pet, just to harm a pet. Like for no other reason, to just be malicious, that's inappropriate. There's not and okay, in some states, and it depends, there are laws against that kind of thing. But in a case where there wasn't, we'd still feel like, even if I'm not going to get in trouble, it still feels inappropriate. I think we could say there's cases of that, and I'd say maybe that, so there is something there to that idea. Maybe it's just when I hear the word norm, certain flags go up and I think about it as a bigger ontological question. Are you saying then that for Serres, this would mean there'd be like some ontological norm, like we're gonna, and I'm also like a little cautious about tales like everything is relationally connected, therefore we should be good to nature. It's like, or not, and we're just still related to nature, like completely, you know, the relational ontology, like I'm very sympathetic to that. But I do wonder if relational ontology ever gets you anything in particular. Like, I think, I don't know, throwing out names, but a lot of people, but Jane Bennett, to me, is one of these figures who sees that norms come out of this relational ontology. I'm not sure that
or psychology of the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, it's a common thing. And I think at this point, there should be a healthy skepticism about that. Do you think Serres is headed down that road where he thinks because it's all related, therefore we'll automatically know what's appropriate? Or is it more complicated and not ontological at all? And he's just like, sometimes we'll think it's appropriate, sometimes we won't. And there's like nothing to do with that, except sometimes a norm will bubble up and then be gone. And at that point, I don't know if we would even want to call it a norm, but.
That's a fantastic question. And so let me start with the last part. So I'm in complete agreement with your skepticism about that leap from we're all interrelated, therefore norm. So I'm committed to some kind of meta-ethical internalism, and that view simply runs afoul of meta-ethical internalism. So Christine Korsgaard raises what she calls the normative question. So you can give me some description of reality, and then it's always plausible from a practical point of view to say, so what, right? So we're all in one tight web with nature. Yeah, so what? Like, what's the link that gets you to a norm? And I think there is none. I think different work needs to be done. So certainly that's not the kind of argument I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to suggest is that if the transcendental argument that I've made, and by the way, at certain point in Serres' work, I think in the Hermès series, he talks about an objective transcendental, which he doesn't use it in this very context, but I think it captures nicely what is at issue in the paper. But it is the condition of possibility for our being the kinds of beings who cognize, who communicate, that there is some kind of deep agreement. In some sense, we speak the language of nature. Now, if I were to stop the account there, you could still raise the Korsgaardian question, so what? But I think the point is this: once I recognize that I speak the language of nature, at that point, I can't see it as a mere object anymore. So what I'm invoking, and I just didn't do this because I didn't have the space to do it, but a more virtue ethics conception of normativity rather than a rule-based one, because you see in your literal perceptual experience what a situation calls for. I ought not to act a certain way because the situation as I perceive it simply doesn't call for that. And so what I'm suggesting in the argument is that once we take on board this notion that we speak a language with nature, it now appears in a way that it hadn't before as something like a quasi-subject, something that we ought not to treat merely as an object.
No, that's okay. It's good. Thanks.
Oh, was that finger at me?
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
I like that a lot. I like hearing ficta when it doesn't bring up Nazism. I'll beat that. That was great. This is actually a follow-up because I actually thought in the way that you were articulating it in the paper and then just now, you were almost headed towards like a Kantian Brandonian sort of like, right, imminent to the very way that I articulate comes with a set of norms, and then you went to virtue ethics, which my answer, like what I was thinking when Thomas was speaking, was something like the reason why you cannot articulate, well, the problem is we're never going to get past the ought is problem, right? Your relational ontology gives me is if it did, we would have solved climate change a long time ago. Ecology conferences are horrible about this. Like you go to them and like, it's, you know, just like, thank you for telling me we're all one, it's the living being, and 3 days of papers like this, right? And you know, and then crying. But what I was thinking, like, but that's the part of the problem too, is that we are still dealing with it as a theoretical ontological set of claims.
Yeah.
And then that's when it sort of dawned on me, oh, that's what he's doing with the virtue, because then it's a phonetic account, right? In sort of Aristotelian, maybe not a Kantian practical reason, but in the sense of I don't need this big overarching ontology of relations, right? But I'm in the midst of it, right? Do you want to say more about? Does that make sense? If it doesn't, I can articulate more.
No, it does.
But it just seems to me like maybe our model of the theoretical, almost platonic, right? I have the theory, I bring it to practice. You're starting if you start the other way, then I could see far more. I could see that does a lot of great work, actually.
Yeah. So I think so you mentioned a Brandamite account, and certainly Brandam influences almost all the things I think, but I think a bridge between the Kantian and the virtue ethics view is John McDowell, who's Kantian, Hegelian, and Aristotelian, right? So yeah, I think the norm is internal to our modes of perception, but this is the McDowell point, our modes of perception are conceptually articulated. So there's no sharp division between mere feeling or a kind of, you know, misty affect-based way of thinking about nature versus a strictly conceptual one. I think our relation to the world is conceptually articulated through and through, and our perception of the world is conceptually articulated through and through. And so I see nature as the kind of thing that calls upon me to do something that can be articulated in a proper proposition. I ought not to treat this thing.
Isn't that bringing it back into a theory, right? Like in other words, if you're bringing it back into, like it's a way of colonizing everything back into the theoretical. Does that make sense? So if, with Aristotle, phronesis is like there's different ways of rationality, and there's phronesis is the relation to that which can change, right? It's not techne, but it's right. So it's related to activity, right? And so what I was thinking is like you don't need this big theoretical glance. You don't have nous, you don't have episteme, you don't have universals. But if we do that, then we don't need these. Oh, what's your ontological claim, right? Like in other words, I'm in doing the best. Like that's what a virtue ethics is, right? It's a messy world, and I'm right, and that seems different. But like so, one at least to me, from my side, and I don't know McDowell well at all. Yeah. But I know the brand stuff. So, but like it sounds like you're constant. Like, oh, now we're back into theory and concepts. If I get the concepts right, then.
Yeah. So I guess what I would, and I'm not sure if this meets you in the middle. I don't think it's the ontology that does the heavy lifting, but I do think there is a conception of what it is to reason, right? So the conception of what cognizing is or reasoning, the ontology comes out of that, but so does the ethics. And so reasoning is what comes first. And I think the transcendental model that I'm trying to articulate is that there are certain norms that are features of our reasoning that are transcendental. And I don't take that to be an ontological claim about what is. I take that to be ontological claims about ways in which we can't help but reason if we're going to be rational.
Thank you. Stephanie
Very much.
has a question.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. I have engaged too much with Serre's natural contract. I want to bring it back to metaphor. in part because I feel like in philosophy and political science, merely metaphor is just a complete misunderstanding of the way that metaphor works. I'm thinking a little bit of Paul Ricard in his theories of interpretation and the way that hermeneutics work and the way that metaphors work. And metaphor, so you're talking a lot about cognition, and then there's kind of this active side of praxis. And for Ricard, metaphor works, yes, first we understand it, but then we have to be able to imagine it. So there's kind of this space of what does that look like? And then we feel it. And it's through kind of this process of the cognition, the imagination, the feeling, that actions, perceptions change, right? So I want to hear more about the imagination for you in the role of this natural contract. And then I'm also thinking a little bit about, like, if we move into the space of linguistics, metaphors we live by, right? Like Alfred Johnson, that like metaphors are doing a lot more than we want to give them credit for. So I guess I want to hear you talk a little bit more about metaphor with respect to Serre's natural contract, because I think this kind of idea that it's merely metaphor, metaphor is such a powerful, and I think, yeah, I think Ferry gets his like metaphorical fable, like separate them out and decide which each of those are doing in Serre's work. And Serre has this really interesting take on the fact that literature can always go deeper than philosophy ever can. Maybe you want to respond to that too. And then my other point about the natural contract is the role of science. I think it's really important to come back to. He is a historian of science. So you pointed Hermès. I think that's a really important part. It's not that kind of you have these kind of the ontological norms. Well, nature in Serre's definition is that which emerges because of that, those different scientific discourses around it. So kind of nature is not this thing that exists outside of society, neither is it socially constructed. I mean, it feels like, sometimes it feels quite complex the way he's trying to articulate those objects as they emerge. But I guess because you spoke a lot to the contract, I wanted you to speak to that word natural a little bit more.
Yeah, so when I'm using the word metaphor, I'm basically taking the sense that Ferry and Roger give it. That is, I'm taking their pejorative sense of that on board, not endorsing that sense, but just running with their sense of it. That is, metaphor as contrasted with clear rational thought. Now, I don't endorse that myself, but I think but I do think there is something of a conflict between the contract as metaphor and the natural contract meant as a genuine contribution to philosophy of law. Because I think if we, and certainly metaphors, like our reasoning, even within the law, is highly metaphorical reasoning. Reasoning by analogy is sort of essential to contractual sort of jurisprudence. But it's constrained, right? That metaphorical thinking, I think, is constrained within bounds that are pretty well fixed. And so I think that there have to be certain elements that are fixed in Serre's conception of the natural contract, and those elements need to be the sort that can give rise to obligations toward nature taken as something at least like a legal subject. Does that address your question, Stephanie? I fear that it doesn't entirely, but.
No, that's fine. I'm not being very fair by asking you to like come into my space of literary theory and talk about metaphor. So tell me more about science. I think you actually alluded to it when you pointed to Hermès, but I think that kind of that term natural and what he means by nature is also I think that could be fleshed out a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that right. So how Fichte is one end of the continuum. So there's the I and the not I, and these are literally contradictory. And yet he finds that it must be the case as a transcendental necessity that there is some kind of synthesis between these two opposites in order for there to be experience, but nonetheless they begin as contradictories. So the other extreme you would think was to say, well, there's no gap at all. Nature and reason, nature and humanity is just one purely continuous thing with no gap at all. I don't think that's Sayre's view. I think there's a lot of things that Sayre says that suggest that, but I don't think that that is Sayre's view. I think there is, so propositionally articulated, inferentially articulated reason, I think just is a qualitatively different sort of communication than the information exchange that we find in the natural world. But propositionally articulated inferential discourse has as its condition of possibility, I think, our embodied ability to pick up on the language of nature. So ironically, I think Sayre is sharply and unfairly critical of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, but I think his view is actually similar to Merleau-Ponty's in this regard. Like we are of nature, we are of the world, and we speak the language of nature, so that our primary relation to nature is not the relationship of a subject to an object that stands over against us. I think there's a deep connection, but I don't think it's a seamless unity.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Flora, please.
Thank you. I agree. This was fantastic, and I'm trying to articulate my question. I'm going back to Rousseau. I think, Michel Serres arguing of Rousseau is a little bit unjustified, because for Rousseau's social contract, there's always a way of escaping. Like, there's always, the members of the contract can always say, we no longer want to be part of the social contract. Whereas I think that this is not something we can do with nature. Actually, we always depend on nature. If I get exposed to cold, I have a cold. So that sort of thing. So I guess my question was, again, what is that natural contract supposed to take a legal form, or is it more a sense of developing a sense of obligation towards nature?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so Sayre in his lifetime had been involved closely in United Nations effort to give some kind of legal status. Now, as I think there's an interesting parallel with international law, with cosmopolitan law, which has a history of moving by baby steps. So you get your foot in the door, you introduce a kind of legal framework in a very little way, with the hope of slowly expanding that. So I think that Sayre means this to be a legal framework, but I also think that he's committed to doing that in baby steps. And the first step is just to introduce the notion that it's not absurd to think of nature as the sort of thing that in principle could be a subject of rights.
Okay, I have another Rousseau question that is, I think this might be a dumb question, I'm not sure. Okay, so it just, okay, what I really liked it, but what I really like is the idea that what we need is a way to look at the natural world as neither not a subject nor a subject, because I was thinking about Rousseau's O'Neill, and okay, so one idea would be to say, okay, by recognizing something as a subject, then you get normative reasons to not treat it merely as a means. But on the other hand, from Rousseau's perspective, actually the sort of okay, so the purpose of Emil's education is sort of to make all contact with humans look as if you're just having contact with natural objects, so that, for instance, when the baby cries, you're not supposed to respond to it, because the moment that the parent responds to the baby crying, the baby is sort of exercising its sort of power in the world, or it's exploring the world, and then it realizes it can control something, and then immediately from that moment, the relationship it has to other humans becomes one of domination. And so it's sort of in that picture, this is Rousseau, whatever, I get it, to respond to your baby when they cry, probably.
I'm sorry, can I break that? I'll have a careful.
But like, so yeah, there, the recognition of the subject is actually the reason to teach it, like to treat it as a mere means. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think Rousseau's view, I think, is just going to be different from Serre's on that point, because I think what Rousseau wants to do is take nature as a source of norms per se. Like nature itself is a model for us.
Mhm,
And
definitely.
I think what Rousseau doesn't have that Serre does have is something like a more modern notion that norms arise out of communication. So the norms aren't, I mean, like this is what I would literally say it in the case of Serre. We often say like norms are not the sort of thing you can read off nature, but that is sort of the thing that Rousseau literally tries to do, to read the norms off from nature. And I think Serre's is a more communicational or process-based ethics. It's just that nature would be the other party to the communication, rather than a source of norms all by itself.
Yeah, gotcha.
Lovely. I think once more, the time has expired before our questions have expired. So please join me in thanking Bryan for his time.